Welcome back to Childlike Chapters. It's Friday, and that means it's time for our second teen edition of the week. And today we are going to read the first chapter of The Last Silk Dress by Ann Rinaldi. Enjoy! The Last Silk Dress by Ann Rinaldi. Prologue. Whenever I think of my father, which is very often, I remember the day of the riot at Tredegar Ironworks. And I think of the way he got hit with the rock and how his face bled. That is the memory that will always come to my mind first, I suppose, when I think of my father. For me, that was the moment the war started. Oh, I didn't know it then. I was at Tredegar for an outing that bright, warm 13th of April, 1861. Fort Sumter had been fired upon the day before, and my father had come home for his noon meal and said that Mr. Anderson, who owned part of Tredegar, was organizing a demonstration, and I'd begged to be allowed to go back with him. So he took me. It was only to be a parade after all, but I can close my eyes and in a moment hear the ugly chanting of the mob as it came down the street. It was supposed to be an orderly procession, but the people were already loudly disorganized. They were singing the Marseillaise. It was an angry singing, and the crowd lunged forward as if borne on hundreds of caterpillar legs. I was on a wooden platform that had been hastily erected in front of Tredegar with Mr. Anderson, my father, who was his chief engineer, and a reporter from the Richmond Dispatch. The very platform seemed to tremble as the mob approached, waving its fists and singing and yelling. Gentlemen, Mr. Anderson held up his hand. Ladies, for there were some amongst them who were pretending to be ladies too. Secession, they were yelling. We want secession. They made a chant of it, and it echoed off the buildings of Tredegar. For a full 3 minutes they chanted as Mr. Anderson held up both arms to quiet them. You shall have secession. I have been to the capital to see the governor. He informed me of his determination to support the Union, but... They booed loudly. They hissed. You've got to quiet them, Joe, I heard my father say to Mr. Anderson. They're getting ugly. Again, Mr. Anderson held up both arms. If you will just listen to me. We're not listening to any speeches, a man from the middle of the mob yelled. We've waited long enough. The Confederacy is being formed. We want to be part of it. A lusty cheer rose from the mob's midst. In the distance, a cannon fired, echoing off the Tredegar buildings. Someone threw a rock, which skidded across the platform. Susan, my father yelled to me, go inside. But I stood rooted to the spot. On to the Capitol, someone yelled, and the cry was taken up like a banner. The crowd surged forward, bumping against the platform, which shook under me. In the next moment, some of the people were rushing across it, and now it trembled and creaked under their weight. I was pushed backward against the front of the building, and for a moment I thought, I am going to be crushed. I am going to be trampled to death. Watch out, little girl, someone yelled in my ear. My bonnet strings were pulled roughly, and the bonnet yanked off my head. Someone else gave me a push, and I landed against the brick wall of the building. Susan! I could hear my father, but I could not see him. I held my breath and flattened myself against the building while the frenzied souls rushed by. Let's have order, I heard Mr. Anderson yelling. We've got to keep it orderly. Susan! I heard my father again. I closed my eyes. I heard a rip and looked down to see my dress torn near the hem. I am going to be killed, I thought. I remember thinking it was all a mistake. I wasn't supposed to be killed today. I only came with my father to see a parade. The flag, someone was yelling. Tear it down! Incredibly, a man was climbing the stonework of the building right over me. His boot got a foothold just above my head, slipped, and jammed down on my shoulder. I cried out in pain and gripped my shoulder, but I could not move because of the onslaught of bodies still rushing past. Susan! Stay there, Susan! Don't move! I saw my father's face in the crowd. He was trying to push toward me, but he couldn't get through. It was like a nightmare, suddenly, one of those dreams from which you wake and find it too real. The stars and bars, the crowd was yelling. Raise the stars and bars! The crowd slowed in its mad stampede to mill about and look up as the stars and bars, the new flag of the Confederacy, was raised above the front doors of Tredegar Ironworks. I took advantage of the lull to push through to my father. I felt his warm, strong hand in mine, saw the tears in his eyes as he too looked up to see the stars and bars floating in the fine April breeze. The crowd cheered lustily. Hats were flung in the air, and the stars and stripes hurtled gently to the ground. It landed a few feet away from us on the platform, and then it happened. My father released my hand and went over to pick up the stars and stripes, and as he did, the rock hit him. I saw him get up with the flag under his arm, saw him reel from the blow, saw the rock hit the platform, and then watched in horror as the blood trickled from the side of his face. "Daddy!" I screamed. "On to the Capitol!" The mob took up the chant again. Desperately, in spite of the pain in my shoulder, I fought my way through to my father, who was standing there getting pushed as the crowd hurried past. "Daddy, are you all right?" "Of course, Susan," he said. He put his hand to the side of his face, took it away, saw the blood, and smiled. "Well," he said, "I believe I'm the first casualty in Richmond of the war." "Come on." I grabbed his hand and pushed hard. I fought my way through the press of bodies. It was like swimming against the waves, as I'd done when I'd been in Charleston while visiting my mama's family. I heard my dress rip again. Someone stepped on my foot. I held my breath and plunged through, holding my father's hand. I felt his strong arm around my shoulder as we made our way toward the front doors of Tredegar. Then, miraculously, my father got the doors open, and we were inside. "Are you all right, Susan?" "I'm fine, Daddy. A bit mussed, that's all. What about you?" He had taken out his handkerchief and was patting the side of his face. "I'll be all right. It's just a scratch." "It's more than a scratch. Look at how you're bleeding." "It's nothing. Come along. Let's go upstairs to my office. We'll wait this thing out." Upstairs in his office, he held the handkerchief to his face. "I never should have brought you. I told Joe it might turn out like this. He wanted to cause excitement among the people," he said. "Well, he's got all the excitement he can handle now." "Daddy, I'm worried about you. Look at your face." "It's nothing, Susan." He walked to the window and stood gazing out on the crowd below. I followed him. When I looked to see if the bleeding had stopped, I saw unchecked tears on his face. "You're crying." "Am I?" He turned from the window and brushed the tears aside. The flag was still bundled under one arm. "I suppose I am." He hugged me, and I caught the familiar fragrance of his tobacco. Wedding cake, it was called, all mixed in with the smell of the soap he used. He stood in the center of the room, smiling at me. "Your mother will disown me for bringing you here today." That's what he was worried about. Mama. That's what he was always worried about. "She doesn't have to know what happened," I said. His smile deepened. "Just look at yourself, Susan." I nodded, looking down at my torn dress. I hate this dress anyway. Mama makes me dress too childish. I'm glad it's torn. "You look fine to me." "Well, I'm not. I'm more grown up than she lets me look." He was smiling at me knowingly. "Don't be in such a rush to grow up, Susan," he said. "I don't think your mother could accept that right now. It only means she's getting older." "Well, it isn't fair that I have to dress so childishly, Daddy. Connie doesn't have the shape I have, and her mama doesn't dress her like this." "I understand," he said gravely, "but I'd like you to stay my little girl a little while longer." He could always win me over like that. "I'll sneak in the back way when I get home. Rhodey will sew the dress for me, and Mama will never know what happened." "I doubt that. Your mother, Susan, has the news-gathering abilities of the best reporter in this city. She'll hear what happened, depend on it. I saw that big ape out there who hit you with his boot as he climbed the wall to hoist the flag. Did he hurt you?" He reached out and touched my shoulder, and I winced. "Move your arm," he directed. I flexed it in a circular motion. "Nothing broken," he mused, "but you'd better have a hot bath when you get home." "Well," he sighed, "they've done it now. We'll have secession all right. Richmonders have waited long enough for it." He went to his desk, took out a bottle of brandy, and poured some into a glass. He drank the brandy, set the glass down, then went to shut the windows, sealing out the world. He still had the flag under his arm. "Don't you want to do something with that flag, Daddy?" I asked. He looked down, remembering it then. The flag, yes. I could tell it meant a lot to him, but that didn't surprise me. He had gone to West Point, but had always hated the Army after he'd graduated and served in it. He said he wasn't aggressive enough for command, but he had a belief in country. These past months, whenever talk of secession had come up, he'd fallen strangely silent. I went to him. "Let's fold the flag," I said. He nodded, and we did so. "Now, what shall I do with it?" he wondered aloud. "I suppose we won't be needing it around here for a while." We looked at each other, and he went to his desk, pulled out a drawer, and put the flag in it. "We may never need it around here again, hey, Susan?" He smiled at me, and I was reminded of how I loved the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the way his hair was going gray where it fluffed around his ears. My father was a good-looking man with an intelligent light in his eyes that drew people toward him. At 48, the lines in his face were friendly, not bitter. I knew his every expression, his every mood, for he was my whole world. The reason for that was simple. I was his only child left at home, and my mama was crazy. Oh, not stark raving crazy, but walking around capable of holding her own crazy. She had been that way for as long as I could remember, and everyone knew it. "And how is your mama today?" people would inquire of me. "Oh, she is just fine," I would say, and they would smile. Poor little girl, that's what they thought of me. The fine ladies of Richmond whispered about Mama behind her back, even while they made half-hearted attempts to put up with her. "Crazy," they would say. "Puts on airs because she comes from that fine plantation near Charleston where her daddy owned over 100 slaves. Well, a lot of good it did to her when she took that trip down there with that beautiful daughter of hers, and the child caught the yellow fever and died. Went against her husband's wishes going down there like that. Good thing he didn't let her take the boy, or she'd have lost him too." Many of the ladies in Richmond remembered my sister Isabel, who had died at the age of 4 before I was born. Isabel, the beautiful golden-haired daughter of Mama's, the one I could never live up to. "I want to talk to you, Susan." I pulled myself to attention. Daddy was having another brandy, sitting behind his desk. "Sit down," he said. He looked so serious, I sat. Outside, the recently made Tredegar cannon boomed, reverberating against the windows. "If a man raises his hand against the Constitution of the United States, he is not a reliable man, Susan," he said. "And he will not be a reliable man for any other government. Do you understand?" I did not, but I lied and said yes. I wanted to understand his anguish because I knew that whatever was bothering him today was important to him. "There is strength in union, Susan. We were a band of brothers before this. Now we are just a band." Cannon boomed again. "I'm confusing you," he said. I smiled at him. "It's all right. These are confusing times, and I never put my feelings about this succession business into words with you before. We're leaving the Union, Susan. Virginia is leaving the Union. What you've heard is that it's a revolution like we had back in 1776. Isn't it?" "I don't know, Susan. I don't know what it is. I may never know. All I am sure of is that it's wrong to break up the Union. And I haven't figured out yet how I shall tear off parts of myself and say this part is for America and this part is for Virginia." He looked so sad that I wished Fort Sumter had never been fired upon by the South. I wished the whole thing had never started. "In January," he recited quietly, "cannonballs cast for both North and South lay side by side on the floor of Tredegar foundries. I saw them with my own eyes." He patted the side of his face with the handkerchief. The gash had stopped bleeding, but the area around it was getting swollen and ugly. Anderson and his partners knew war was coming, but they needed every dollar they could scrape up to get out of financial difficulties. They found a way of breaking off pieces of themselves, you see. I started to speak, but thought better of it. "What do you think that crowd out there would do if they knew about our northern customers here at Tredegar, Susan?" "I think they'd storm the building," I said. He smiled. "Right. But war makes good business, Susan. It will bring in a lot of money. Still, I shouldn't be burdening you with this. You're just a child." "I'm 14 and I understand," I said. "I know you do. You always were intelligent. Too bad you weren't born a boy. You deserve to go to the university. Are you still running off from your mother and hiding in your brother's room and reading his books?" I blushed. "Who told you that, Daddy?" "Rhodey. Don't worry. Your secret is safe with me. We have to confide in each other these days." He sighed. "Speaking of your brother, which I seldom, if ever, do, I've been thinking of him more and more these days. War comes and a man thinks of his son." I waited. I held my breath. Rarely, if ever, did he speak to me of Lucian. Your brother is an abolitionist. He doesn't believe in slavery. Did I ever tell you that, Susan? You never told me anything about him, Daddy. He nodded gravely. Do you remember anything about him at all? I chose my words carefully. When he used to come home from college, he was nice to me. He brought me things. He used to put me up in front of him on his horse and take me for rides. He raised his eyes to look at me. What else? But he knew, and he was waiting for me to say it. You had an awful fight with him. I remember you shouting at each other a long time ago when I was about 7, and then he left. Yes, he mused, he left. He sighed deeply, and when he spoke his voice was raspy. He's still in Richmond, you know. Yes, Daddy, I know. All the ladies in Mama's circle gossip about him and the unforgivable things he does to make a living. He smiled sadly. I don't think he's as notorious as all that, Susan. The ladies your Mama is trying to impress would gossip about anything. Have you seen him, Daddy? Only once in 7 years. A mistake, he nodded sadly. I shouldn't have tried to see him. It went badly. I made a lot of mistakes with your brother. I'm not proud of them. If things had been different, I would have had him here now to discuss my views with. Not that you aren't doing fine. Yes, just fine. He poured himself another brandy. Daddy, are you sure you're all right? I'm as all right as a man can be, just having seen the flag of his country torn down. Look, I'm going to confide in you. I expect you'll keep my confidence. Of course, Daddy. A band struck up outside, and we listened for a moment to the bright and sassy music. Then he went on. A good portion of my money is in banks in Liverpool, England. I think we're on a fool's errand here in the South with this war, Susan. My heart is with the Union, but this is the only time you'll hear me say it. When we walk out of this office today, I am a true Southerner. Does that seem hypocritical to you? You could never be hypocritical, Daddy. He smiled. I shall continue to work for the Confederacy through my job here. I owe Mr. Anderson for his faith in me. I owe Virginia, and I owe your mother, who is a staunch Confederate. Life has broken her heart too many times. I will not add to her heartache. But in the practical matters of money, I'm betting on the North. That way my family won't be bankrupt when this is over. I nodded. My father had always been a shrewd businessman, so this meant little to me. One more thing, Susan. I've been watching you. You love the cause, don't you? I blushed. I just wished Mama would let me do more for it, that's all. You want to please her. He sighed. I know the feeling. I'm sorry for the way your mother is, Susan. I know it's difficult for you. You've taken the brunt of it with her. She can't help the way she is. The 3 children she lost. The trouble with Lucien. He waved off those thoughts. And she never did like living here in Richmond. Perhaps I shouldn't have brought her this far north. They never quite accepted her here, and there have been, he blushed somewhat, other difficulties in our marriage which I cannot discuss with you. I know it seems to you that she just won't be pleased sometimes. Give her time. With the war coming, I'm sure you'll be drawn closer together. And there is something else. He cleared his throat. Yes, Daddy? I know that in the months to come, you'll have questions about the war. You say you love the cause. Right now to you, it's parades and bright music and parties and speeches and songs. But it's more than that. Much more. Our life is going to change, Susan. I know that in the months to come, you'll have questions about the war if you're any daughter of mine. I don't know if I'll be here to answer them for you. You mean you're going away again? I felt a sense of alarm. You've traveled so much for Mr. Anderson. Just in this past year you went north, and in November you went to Harper's Ferry, and in February to Charleston. I had to go north to the armories to get patterns and drawings for muskets, Susan, before the Republicans took over the War Department in Washington. I did the same thing in Harper's Ferry, and in February I had to confer with Governor Pickens in Charleston about the ammunition needs of the Southern batteries. I must go where my job sends me. That's why I'm talking to you like this, because I know you're bright and you'll have questions about the war. And when that time comes, I want you to do what you think in your heart is right. We looked at each other. What was he saying? Yes, Daddy, I said. Listen to me carefully, Susan. If this time ever comes, and you'll know it when it does, do what you think is right, even if it hurts those around you, those you love. That is the most difficult thing we must ever learn to do. Do you understand what I am saying, Susan? I think so, Daddy. Remember that I told you this. When your brother left, it was because of something I did to please your mother. We can't do things to please others, Susan, not if we don't think what we are doing is right. Now do you understand? Yes, Daddy, I breathed. Susan, don't cry. I can't help it. I don't like seeing you like this. I know, but promise me you'll remember what I told you here today. I promise. Good. He got up. Look, some people have started to light torches for the orderly procession to the Capitol. Hear that? The church bells are ringing. I went to stand beside him at the window, and we listened to Richmond's bells and watched an orderly crowd assemble. Afterward, we went downstairs to our carriage. On the way home, he told me stories about when he was at West Point. He knew I loved those stories. I had heard them dozens of times, as other children had heard fairy tales. Whenever I remember my father, I think of how he was that day at Tredegar Iron Works, the day after the war started when he got hit with the rock picking up the American flag. The day he told me to do what I thought in my heart was right, when the time came that I must do it. Even though it might hurt those I loved, that, I think, is how I shall always remember him. I hope you enjoyed hearing the first chapter of The Last Silk Dress. It's a story set in the Civil War, and it's a really great book. I hope you check it out.